Welcome to Postdoom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm Michael Dowd, your host, and in this conversation, recorded in November of 2019, I speak with a longtime friend and colleague, Michael Brownlee. Michael is really a leading voice in the local food revolution. In fact, he wrote a book by that title, The Local Food Revolution, How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times, back in 2016. And then in 2018, Reclaiming the Future, How to Lead the Local Food Revolution in Your Community. Michael lives in Boulder, Colorado with his partner, Lynette Marie, and he's a beautiful soul, and I think you'll enjoy this conversation. How are you doing just in terms of your work and your life, and just give me a catch up with regards to you?
Yeah, it's changing really radically, Michael. I'm amazed at how much things have changed. We spent more than a decade working on localization, right on the front lines. Where this was our full work, and one of the things that we realized in that was that in doing that, taking that kind of leadership role in the community, that we were creating a dependency, that the community was depending on us to carry that role.
Oh, sure.
And when we saw that, that's when we started unloading. Saying, "Oh yeah, we have to withdraw." And so we started that process of withdrawing, and at the same time, that allowed us to go back to really our first love, which is working with individuals who are deeply called. And so, after I published my first book on the local food revolution, we started doing online courses and around food first, but then it gave way finally. I mean, last August we launched this course, A Deeper Calling, and it is it's really pushed us. I mean, it's been bubbling in the background for a few years, and finally we realized we had to do it. And it's taken our work to a much deeper level, much more radical. But so part of what's in your first version of the questions that you had, you brought up the issue of restoring the past. And so we so many people, Charles Eisenstein and lots of others have said, we're missing a story here. We don't have the story. We don't have a story. And so I feel like we're in the process of discovering that story, and that I have a role to play in that. That's pretty traumatic in itself.
Sure.
Because I'll talk about that a bit.
Okay, great.
Because it's not just me, but there is a story that's beginning to land, on our planet. And it completely recontextualizes our past as well as the future. So we know each other from a past that gives some context to our conversation, and that is we met around the issue of Y2K. Which was at least 400 years ago. I don't know.
I've got to tell you a fun story. I was just with Tom Atlee just a few days ago.
Yeah.
And he gave me a copy of his Awakening to Y2K, or Y2K Awakening. I forget, whatever that little book was. And it reminded me of our connection back then, because I mentioned to him that I'd be talking to you.
So we were paying attention. We saw something, felt something that few others could see or feel at that point, and then that's kind of, the background that we share. And so what happened for Lynette Marie and I was in early 2005, a little known and pretty mysterious spiritual teacher sat me down and said, look, you need to find a way for the region around Boulder, Colorado to become resilient and self-reliant in the face of these changes that are going to be coming upon us that no one else is paying attention to right now. And so, knowing that we had no idea how to do that. I mean, first of all, we had to get educated as to exactly the dimensions of our predicament, and then starting to look at what might we do locally. It led us to the early days of the localization movement, with Julian Darley, Post Carbon Institute. We affiliated with them early on, and that led later on to affiliating with the Transition Towns movement. Rob Hopkins, we helped bring that to this country, to North America, actually. And
yeah, I mean, you were I forget what the title, director, or you were some leadership role in Transition USA, weren't you?
Yeah, I was on the board.
Yeah.
With and Richard Heinberg was on the board at that time. I mean, there was a close relationship between Transition US and Post Carbon Institute.
Yes.
And also, we were trying to follow the work of Helena Norberg Hodge with Local Futures. I mean, so those were the three arenas where localization was being talked about. And so we went to work here, and we tried to learn from those people. In a short period of time, we focused on food, because we knew, especially after spending time with Richard Heinberg, we knew that was our most urgent issue, where we were most vulnerable in this country. So we dove into how do we localize our food supply. And that, we became leaders in the localization movement, and we were pretty dismayed by that, because if we were leaders and people thought of us as examples, we knew we were really in trouble. Because nobody knew how to do this. Nobody. And even though they said they did, they didn't. And so there were a lot of people who were trying, but anyway, we experimented, we did our best here. But a few years ago, we decided to sort of pull back from the frontline work of localization in this arena and start working with individuals. Our real passion is working with individuals who find themselves with a mysterious but profound, deep inner calling, to somehow rise to the greatest occasion in human history. But they don't know what to do or how to get on with it, and they find themselves usually alone and with no support. So we have developed trainings and courses for people like that.
Well, say just a little, say a little bit about your writing as well as your trainings and courses.
Oh yeah, so the first major book after Y2K that I published was The Local Food Revolution, which I guess was in late 2015. How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times was the subtitle of that book. It was about 450 pages. It was a serious effort to guide people who are called to that kind of work of building regional food systems. And there are those people, and it's one of the greatest challenges in the world. How do we do that? So after that book, we created the Local Food Academy as a training program, online training program. And so that's taken us into working with individuals like we love to do. And we've been working with people all over the world on that level. And then, 2 or 3 years ago, we started feeling that there was another level of the work coming, that we needed to pay attention to. So a year ago, August, we launched an online course called A Deeper Calling, which it includes much we have learned about food localization, but applying the same principles to any arena of calling.
Yeah.
So that's been our primary focus, and increasingly we will move in that direction. And so, you know, I just finished a new book that kind of comes out of that work called Navigating the Anthropocene: From Planetary Emergency to Evolutionary Emergence.
Wow. Say a little bit about that.
Wow, it's hard to speak about, because it's been a book that's been knocking on my door for quite a while, and I finally realized that I had to pay attention to it. I had to give it a runway in my own being and allow this voice to be expressed. And so I'm learning how to be an expression of a voice for evolution, I would say. You know, it's not just my voice, but it's also my voice. I mean, I'm involved. I'm not a passive participant.
Mm-hmm.
But so we're just beginning to make that available now.
Okay. And by a voice for evolution, are you meaning that in sort of a directional sense, or in an adapting to what's real sense? I mean, what are you meaning by sort of a voice for evolution? How are you seeing or holding that?
Oh, not an easy question to answer. Maybe as we get into our conversation, I'll be able to pull some of that up.
Okay. Yep. That's
But
fine.
you know, we're really at the very early stages of understanding evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there is an evolutionary perspective that's landing on the planet. It has been, you know, since Teilhard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a voice that's coming through this evolutionary force that needs expression in the world today.
The language that we're using for this series is Postdoom,
Yeah.
Conversations Exploring Overshoot, Grief, Gratitude, and Grounding. And I'm just wondering, how does that language land with you? What does Postdoom mean to you? And then sort of how do you describe our deteriorating and contracting times?
Yeah, you know, yeah, I've been thinking about this ever since you used the words Postdoom, that I first heard you use the words or read you use them. And I'm not sure we're ready to talk about post-doom, because I feel like we're actually teetering on the precipice of truly experiencing doom. You know, we think we know what doom is. We haven't seen it yet. So right now we're in sort of this pre-trauma stage, and that's where most of our grief is occurring, as a kind of pre-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
So I love what David Wallace Wells said in the first line of his book, The Uninhabitable Earth. It's worse, far worse than you think. And so here's what I think needs to be said now. It's far worse than even the best informed among us think. It's far worse than almost anyone thinks. And we're just barely beginning to grasp the enormity and complexity of our predicament. And
yes.
So for instance, what we'd like to think that what we sort of insipidly call climate change, you know, it's not climate change. We're actually heading into climate catastrophe. I mean,
yes.
let's be clear about that. But what's happening with the climate, there's so much attention around climate. Climate is just a symptom
yes.
of a much deeper and wider problem. And we haven't even begun to think about what that is, let alone how to address it. So I'm very concerned that if we put all of our energies into trying to respond to a symptom, then this is likely not to end well.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you said that. I mean, I could not possibly agree more. But I didn't hold that position, I don't think, until January of 2015 when I read William Catton's book Overshoot.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized that climate change and overpopulation and species extinction, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the rise of oligarchies and fascism and all the rest. I mean, I could, we both could probably list another 30 things, are symptoms of overshoot. And even that is a symptom of what I call idolatry. That is human-centeredness rather than life-centeredness.
Yeah.
And,
so I want to go into that a bit.
Great.
But before I get there, I want to talk about the other side of the coin here.
Okay.
Because the other side of this is that what is emerging out of our predicament turns out to be far better, more profoundly encouraging and inspiring than almost anyone is able to see right now. And we're blind to this because we're caught up in the drama of mass extinction and the death throes of human civilization. So it's both, almost like Tom Atlee, it's both far worse and far better than even the best informed among us currently think. And what that means for most of us is that we can't see what's happening in the big picture sense and where we are in it, where we as humanity. So for me, the focalizing term now is the Anthropocene epoch, which you could say is the Anthropocene cataclysm. The planet is now entering a dark age. It's a time of climate catastrophe, biosphere collapse of human civilization, mass extinction, which could include us. And this is what many of us have been waking up to lately, and it's horrible. It's horrible. Yes. And there's no avoiding it. We've already passed the tipping point. But more deeply, and this is the profound news about all of this. This is actually also the time of an evolutionary course correction, which after what will probably be a very long period of healing and restoration and regeneration could take this planet into what Thomas Berry called the Ecozoic era, when humanity and the biosphere begin to achieve a level of conscious equilibrium and co-creativity that's never been seen on this planet before. And at that point, you could say that the entire biosphere would be a conscious being. And so,
wow. I mean, I want you to lean into that a little bit more, because on the one hand, given all that I've studied in the last 25 years, I'm profoundly allured to a lot of that. There's a piece of it that that I wonder about, especially in terms of, you granted that the sixth great extinction may include us, and if it includes us, I'm wondering how you see the Ecozoic unfolding or emerging. But in any case, however, I want to hear what inspires you in terms of how you see these chaotic, challenging, breakdown, collapsing, both human and biospheric collapse, how you see that sort of catalyzing something from an evolutionary standpoint that's truly profound and a breakthrough.
So maybe the preface to that is to say that it looks like this course correction, this evolutionary course correction, is preparing it in the midst of catastrophe here, is preparing the way for the next stage of evolution of life on this planet.
With or without humans.
In which evolution becomes conscious, but what's happening is because of where we've gotten ourselves, the corner we've painted ourselves into. I mean, it's kind of an evolutionary Hail Mary pass that we're facing right now. So for myself, from the time I was very young, I had a deep sense that this whole world was careening headlong into unprecedented disaster. And this wasn't fair to a little kid, but this was informed by several sets of recurring dreams that I had that led me to understand that somehow I had been present at some of the worst tragedies in human history, including the death of Jesus. And in most of these scenarios, in these dreams, I was not just a witness, but I was actively engaged in what was happening. So I came to assume that, although I could never talk about this with anybody, that I had something that I came here to do in our current disaster.
Yes.
And so on a personal level these days, for a while I felt guilty because I was not experiencing the kind of grief that many people are putting much effort into processing these days. And I realized finally it's because I don't have a great deal of sadness and grief left to process, because I've gone through this before in many different ways.
Yes. And you had these visions or dreams in like 1960s or 70s?
No, I mean, starting in the early 50s.
How old are you? I forget how old you are.
I'm turning 73 next month.
Oh, 73. Okay, so you're 6 years older than Connie. I for some reason thought you were roughly Connie's age. Okay, all right, continue. Yeah.
So I feel, that in ways that I don't really understand, but I've already experienced extraordinary grieving, and including the grief and the despair of our North American peoples who lost virtually everything. And so it's not that I'm totally immune to grief and sadness now. It's just that I seem to be prepared to be functional and ready to spring into action at a time of crisis. So I'm on the other side. I'm not paralyzed by this.
Well, that's actually what I'm meaning. I mean, just so you know, because we haven't had this conversation yet, for me, post-doom isn't about the external, that we're not quite, at least for most people, they're not quite at doom yet. Doom, what we're meaning is a completely subjective. It's like when you get that the myth of perpetual progress is a myth and that we are looking at serious contracting, collapsing times, both socially and economically, that hits most people emotionally as, oh, fuck, like doom.
Yeah, right.
And so post-doom is the place where it sounds like you got to very, very early on.
Well, and it took a long time, for it to sink in. I couldn't make sense out of those dreams or why I would have them or what they meant. It's taken decades, to sort of put all the pieces together. But I felt like I was born for these times, and I've met many, many other people who feel that I was born for this. This is why I'm here. Not to avoid this, but because there's work to do, and it requires whatever it is that we have within us. So.
Yeah, amen.
So. When we see that evolution is a force that's moving in and through this time of cataclysm, just like the supernova explosion that comes out of the death of a dying star, and we can begin to gain some sense, if we begin to gain some sense of what's on the other side of the cataclysm, then we can hold all this destruction and suffering in a very different way.
Yes,
it's all part of the process. It's going somewhere, and it's taking us somewhere. But the Anthropocene, even if the recovery from the Anthropocene takes millions of years, which it's likely to, that's just a very brief moment of the evolution of life on this planet.
Yeah.
Very brief. And besides all of that, we're finally getting the perspective that life for us doesn't begin and end with a physical body. That our life on this planet, or even a series of lifetimes here, is but a very small part of our journey. And this is part of the reality that we're beginning to experience as we approach species adulthood.
Yeah.
And so here I want to talk about, do you know Jack Alpert?
I know of Jack Alpert. I've never met him.
I had the fortune last year of getting to know Jack, and you know, I love Jack Alpert. You know, he's working with numbers mostly developed by David Pimentel and others who worked on this together. And Jack says that, look, 10 billion people are going to die by the end of this century, and that includes those who will be born between now and then. And humanity is, if we survive, is going to shrink drastically.
Yes.
In population. He says it's just inevitable that we'll get down to around 600 or 700 million by 2100.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And one way or the other we'll get there. And he's convinced that we don't have to do this the hard way. It doesn't have to be a tragedy. But he says that unless we collectively choose to drastically reduce our population, it will become a tragedy of great proportions, untold suffering. And I think he's right. But
well, you know, let me just jump in if I could, because you're the first person that's brought up anything like this, and it matches some stuff that Connie and I have talked about, because as you know, because we've, you know, had these conversations with you and Lynette Marie, you know, Connie and I hold death and mortality and impermanence in a sacred, meaningful way. Yeah. And it seems to me that if there was a way of making it a sacrifice in the true term of what sacrifice means, to make sacred, that in responsibly, honorably, sacredly taking our own lives, and that millions of people and ultimately billions of people could be inspired or motivated to do that, that would be enormous. I don't know that it's possible, but my God, it's a very interesting thought.
It is, and he has a plan as to, you know, a proposal as to how to accomplish that, and that's without suffering, that's without suicide. You know,
wow. Well, where would one go? Like, what would one Google to learn more about that if somebody's interested?
Just Google Jack Alpert. You'll find him. Jack Alpert and population. But I think, you know, there's something really important about what Jack's saying. But I also think that given the lateness of the hour now, that it's highly unlikely that we'll make the optimal choices now. Yeah. We're heading down a very hard road, and we're unstoppable. It seems we're going over the cliff. I mean, we have to get used to that. We're going over the cliff. So, but what's interesting about Jack is he says that 600 or 700 million people could survive on the planet. That's about a sustainable number anyway. The earth, or what's left of the arable land by that time, could sustain those people. But he says, by the way, their existence would be very hard scrabble. Literally everyone would be farming full-time every single day just to be able to eat. And they wouldn't have the tools that we have now. They'd be farming with sticks, he says. Yes. So survival would be full-time. So, and that rings true to me. But he suggests that we'd be far better off. We'd be far better off if we consciously, compassionately reduced our numbers down to about 50 million people by the end of the century. And that these people should cluster around 3 bioregions in the world that have the capacity of being self-sustaining. And he'll tell you exactly where those bioregions are. He has all the data. It's not my job to share that, but I think he's on to something. But who in the world is even remotely ready for this conversation? You know, exactly. We're still at the deer in the headlights stage here. Yeah. You know, so you know, the greatest sadness, you know, because grief is certainly an undercurrent, a thematic undercurrent here. The greatest sadness for me is personally seeing how difficult it is for people to not only wake up, but to respond to what they're awakening to. Yeah. You know, and I had the opportunity to live on the Navajo reservation for a while, many years ago. And the Navajos have this wonderful sayings that it's impossible to awaken someone who is pretending to be asleep.
Oh, that's interesting. I love that. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. You know, our resistance goes really deep, and you know, we've all heard the saying, "Many are called, but few are chosen." Right?
Yeah.
And I think about that differently. I think many are called, but few choose to respond to the call. And you could say that call is from evolution itself. And I also think of the Christian parable of the sower and the seed. And there's a lot of rocky and barren ground out there.
Yes.
And whether this planet will be able to support the kind of life that the forces of evolution seem to intend here, it remains to be seen.
I'm curious, how would you describe, or how would you say that this big picture that Joanna Macy and Thomas Berry and Miriam McGillis and others have talked about, how has that, I mean, you've already talked a little bit, but how's that informed you, and how does that, and what other sources of inspiration or sources of knowledge or sources of empowerment have you found most helpful or meaningful over the years?
Yeah, it's a long conversation, but what's clear to me, you know, is that we're just beginning to wake up to the meaning of evolution, just beginning, you know, and this, you know, the ball started rolling, it appears, with Teilhard de Chardin, and people like Brian Swim and Thomas Berry have given us just tremendous perspective, but I feel like they've only opened the door just a crack, and our understanding is still very primitive. Partly because it's based almost solely on science. and our science is still quite primitive. I mean, our science is still unable to consider the spiritual evolution, or how spirit becomes clothed in matter. And there's a much bigger story that's unfolding here. And so this is something I want to share that is sort of outside the normal realm of conversation that most of us would have about these issues. And this comes from the contemporary mystic Peter Kingsley. I don't know if you're familiar.
Peter who?
Kingsley.
I don't know Peter. No, I don't know of his work.
Well, he's about to he's about to emerge. He's been very quiet, but he gives us some insight into the rise and fall of civilizations that's extremely relevant now. So I want to read a passage from Kingsley. So this is from the very end, the last 2 pages of his book called A Story That Is Waiting to Pierce You. This is Kingsley. He said, "Civilizations never just happen. They are brought into existence quite consciously, with unbelievable compassion and determination from another world. Then the job of people experienced in ecstasy is to prepare the soil for them, carefully sow and plant them, care for them, watch them grow." He says the simple truth is that every single civilization, including this Western world, was brought into being from a sacred place to serve a sacred purpose. And when that purpose is forgotten, when its original alignment gets lost, when the fundamental balance of harmony of its existence becomes distorted beyond a certain point, then nature has her way. He said, just as civilizations have come to an end, there can even be times of global extinction. He wrote this, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago. Okay. He says, but always there are people who know how to gather the essence of life and hold it safely, protect it, and nurture it until the next seeding. They're the ones who are entrusted to turn the pages of life, to open the book of a civilization and close it. They're the ones who are given permission to sound the note that will bring a new world into being, and then sing the song that will bring it nearer to its close. They are the watchers who know the real meaning of responsibility and compassion, who are needed to witness the beginnings and the endings, because without the simple power of attention, nothing can ever be done. Then he says, and all we can do is sometimes catch a glimpse of what they do without having the slightest clue about the process as a whole. So this is a whole different perspective, and it lands at a time when our civilization is dying, our biosphere is dying. What's next? You know, and so what's becoming clear is that something radically new and unexpected is emerging. You know, Stuart Kaufman talks about this, a new uninhabited evolutionary niche emerges, but it's uninhabited, you know, but we have the potential of inhabiting that. And you know, one of the aspects of this is what you know, Joel Premack and Nancy Abrams have seen as the birth of the cosmic society. You know, very mystical language for people who are coming from a scientific perspective. But we could think of this as the emergence of an entirely new species of intelligent life. Not just humans looking differently, but an entirely new kind of being in the universe. And the evolutionary ethicist John David Garcia saw this same vision more than 40 years ago, and he called it the moral society. But the question becomes, who are we in all of this? What's really being asked of us, and who or what is doing the asking? But the opportunity, it appears, that we have is to birth a conscious planet, a conscious biosphere, which can be a beacon of contagious aliveness and conscious evolutionary spirituality in a universe that appears to be largely barren, you know. And so,
I'm curious, how do you see that, or how do you understand that, or maybe just how do you intuit that would be different than, say, the first 95 to 98% of human history, where we lived in small enough communities and with a sense of limits as sacred, and with a sense of sort of life-centeredness, not human-centeredness. How do you see this evolution of consciousness and humanity at this scale being different or distinct from sort of life in the garden, to speak mythically, like how we were until human-centeredness and cities and sort of a more self-destructive way emerged?
Well, I think that it has to do with, you know, as Joel and Nancy point to, this cosmic society has a role far beyond just this planet. You know,
for those who are listening to this conversation or watching it, just as a context, so who Michael is referring to is Joel Premack and Nancy Ellen Abrams, who are dear friends and colleagues of ours, who wrote a book. Well, they've written a few books, but the first major one was The View from the Center of the Universe. And just so you know, Joel Premack is they call him the Dark Lord. He's sort of really the cosmologist, one of the leading and most respected cosmologists on the planet, who really worked out the mathematics for dark matter and dark energy. And Nancy is not only his wife, but also an amazing, brilliant writer and philosopher herself. And so these two have written books that bring together science, our best evidential understanding of reality, and sort of mythic or inspiration, let's just say inspiration, in ways that many of us find deeply, deeply nourishing.
Yeah. So they're pointing to the possibility that the evolutionary design here is that something gets birthed here. We may not even have to call it human, but something gets birthed here on this planet that has a role far beyond just this Earth in the universe itself. And so the enterprise that begins to emerge here, it's vastly different from the mere change making that many of us had been caught up in previous decades, and Carolyn Baker, bless Carolyn, she's been absolutely heroic in her insistence that we're going through a process of collective initiation.
Yes.
And that's profoundly useful. And never mind for the moment what it is that we're being initiated into, but it's clear that this is an initiation. And so that the deeper reality that we can start to perceive is that on the other side of this initiation, if we survive, and people often don't survive through initiations, we will be asked to initiate something that does not exist today.
Wow. I mean, this is it's an integrative vision that I can see how you find it deeply inspiring, and makes sense of most of what I know. I just haven't languaged it in this way, especially because it seems like you both hold this as like this is going to happen if a remnant of humanity survives, but it's not likely to be thwarted even if humanity goes extinct, which is a rather extraordinary stance.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So, one of the things that I think we learn, and Brian Swim kind of helps to get to this, that evolution is relentless. It's unstoppable. It's going somewhere, and it's going to get there. And it runs into obstacles and setbacks and all of that, but it never stops. The good news about all of that is that we discover that we can begin to trust this universe that we live in.
Yeah, well, for me, that's trusting the universe, accepting reality, trusting reality. Those are like secular ways of saying faith in God. They're trusting this larger reality that is embedded, embodied, incarnate, revealed, expressed in time and in nature.
Exactly.
And putting your trust in that, whether we survive or not, that can be trusted. And I think that's the fundamental stance of faith, personally.
So, the next sort of insight for me about all of this has been realizing that as a species, we are really in the very early stages of becoming human. I mean, we think we understand what being human is, but I don't think so. I think we're very early, and so this is another piece of the story that this was really opened up for me by Daniel Quinn. So we could say now that roughly 10,000 years ago, we took an evolutionary wrong turn. When we adopted what Daniel called totalitarian agriculture,
Right.
and that whole paradigm has gone viral, it's gone global, and it's eventually resulted in our global industrial civilization, which is now destroying the planet's ability to support life. So for 10,000 years, which is again is a very brief period of time, we have been increasingly displacing nature to amass wealth and power and control for the few. So that's a self-terminating system. And so what's happened over the last 10,000 years represents devolution, not evolution.
Yes.
And that's the meaning of the Anthropocene. It's an evolutionary setback. So, and it was partly Carolyn Baker. I heard her talk recently about, so much focus on climate change, especially in the discussion in the audience. And I said, well, I just feel like, we're focusing on symptoms here. And she said, well, then what is the underlying problem? And I couldn't say a word. I was like paralyzed. And so that's been rolling with me ever since. And so what I feel like I can say now is that humanity's fundamental problem is that we have been increasingly resisting evolution.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I want to hear more on that, but I'm also aware that one of the big things that shifted for me since the last time we stayed with y'all is that I used to interpret ecology in the light of evolution. In other words, for me, evolution was fundamental or primary, and ecology was understood in that light. And ever since I read William Catton's book, Overshoot, it's now flipped. I now interpret evolution in the context of ecology. For me, ecology is really the heart of theology. Ecology is our best understanding of the way that God's body, life, nature with a capital N, works, and that we need to work within that for us to survive and thrive. And it sounds to me like you may still, and not even still, because that taints it. It basically implies that I'm right and you're wrong. That you interpret that for you, evolution is fundamental. And I'm just wondering, have you read Catton's Overshoot?
Sure.
And so
it's been a few years.
Yeah.
but yeah, I would say that, but the way that we have come, that science has interpreted evolution, is quite different from the kind of evolution that I think we're talking about here, which as Kingsley is pointing to, he uses the word comes from another world. I would say that it comes from the spiritual realm. That's where it begins. That's very different than that something that just somehow miraculously, mysteriously, through the process of selection shows up in the universe. I don't buy it. There's more intentionality behind this. And we don't understand that. We don't understand it.
Yeah. Well, this leads to the last few questions I want to touch on related to human nature and death. So anything that I'm assuming you've seen the questions that I emailed, anything that you have to say or that you would like to say related to how you see our understanding of human nature, either furthering or hindering the sort of the evolutionary transformations that we should be a part of or participating in, and then anything about mortality or death that you want to share.
Yeah, sure. There was a film recently, and I'm gonna blank on the title, but it's about seeds, and it looked at the life of the Hopi who are growing corn under the most impossible situations. Sacred corn. And one of the elders who's been doing this all of his life said, we are not born Hopi. We become Hopi by tending sacred corn.
Yes.
So we could say that we are not born human. We have the potential of becoming human by tending the emergence of the sacred in the world.
Okay, sure.
So when we talk about human nature, we have a pretty skewed view of human nature because we really don't know what it is.
Yeah.
It's on the other side of our initiation, that we can even begin to. I mean, children can't envision what it's like to be an adult, right?
Yeah.
They get little, their own interpretations of it, but until you're experiencing it, if we, and this is, there have been several people that have drawn me into this. Arthur M. Young is one, Christopher Alexander is another. But if we study the patterns of evolution, we can begin to see how, and I have to put these words in quotes almost, we can begin to see how spirit tunnels into the realm of the physical and brings healing and regeneration and even actually creates life. And then here's the almost impossible part to talk about, but I feel compelled to talk about it, that if we study the beings that we might call the angels of evolution, we see that they have been working behind the scenes for thousands of years to make possible what's just beginning to emerge now, that we call the deep revolution. And they've had their failures and their setbacks, because their only agency here, whatever these beings may be, is through humans. You know, and the failure, and I'm just going to do this, Michael, and say
Go
that
for
the failure of the Jesus mission was perhaps their greatest setback. And this was a mission for which they had prepared for many centuries, including the appearance of the axial religions and traditions. That was their project, you know, part of the evolutionary course correction. They were laying the foundation for a moral and ethical society that could become global over the early centuries of the first millennium AD. And that's, I mean, this is tying back into what Peter Kingsley is saying as well. You know, that's why the ancient Greek culture and the Roman Empire were established. That's why the library at Alexander was established. You know, the greatest learning center in human history. All of this foundation was being built for an event, an evolutionary infusion, you could say, that was to happen in conjunction with this person that we know historically called Jesus. And we know almost nothing about him and his mission because his life and his work was brought to an untimely end.
Wow.
So
Okay.
there was a lot riding on him in evolutionary terms. And of course, not just him, but he had something very specific to do. But with his death, it remained undelivered and essentially unknown in the world. And that's one of the greatest tragedies, you know, in human history, the source of great suffering in the world today, because he could have ignited this deep revolution 2,000 years ago. And it would have, because of the foundation that had been laid, it would have quickly spread throughout the world. And we would have entered the Ecozoic epoch in perhaps a few hundred years. We would have not had to go through the Anthropocene. We would have not had to go through population overshoot. But all of that foundation was wiped out, was obliterated. And the Roman Empire collapsed. The library at Alexandria was burned to the ground. And all of that knowledge and wisdom of the world just went up in smoke. And the world was plunged into the Dark Ages. You know, so.
Well, you know, you are outlining a pretty well thought out and coherent metaphysical worldview. If somebody is listening to this or watching this conversation and who wants to know more, learn more, do they just contact you? Is there an author or authors that have written about this? Or like, where does somebody go to lean more into and learn more about this perspective that you're articulating that nobody else in this conversation series has brought up?
There are many, you know, I think Christopher Alexander is essential.
Well, I mean, I've read all of Pattern Language, and it was a part of one of the first permaculture-based eco-villages.
I'm not talking about that. You know, the work that came much later in his life, the 4-volume series on the nature of order, is where he really delves into the spiritual. And most people have not. I mean, they're really intimidating books. I mean, they're big. They're very very intense. You know, and it was Miriam McGillis who introduced us to that work of Alexander. And you know, when she didn't even say what it was, she just set the books up on the table in her library quietly and sat down. And Tom Atlee was in the room that day, I remember. But once I realized, you know, how important they were, I said, well, I'm going to take the next 6 months and read these. And she just laughed at me.
Wow.
She said, it will take you years. And she was right. You know, and there's much there that's really important. I mean, he's really showing us how we can be vehicles for the expression of evolution.
Wow.
You know, and that's what he was doing in his work as an architect. And
Yeah.
you know, he didn't do architectural drawings. He didn't do blueprints. He was responding to something much deeper. And anyway, so he's one. There are many others. I would certainly recommend John David Garcia, who very, very few people know about. The book is called Creative Transformation. Unfortunately, he died prematurely, but Marshall Vion Summers, who is the spiritual teacher that set us on this path originally of localization, he's here in Boulder.
Marshall, what's his middle name?
Vion, V-I-A-N.
Marshall
Summers.
Vion Summers, okay.
Yeah, his work is very, very important in understanding this perspective. And I would say particularly in understanding the role of the angelic or spiritual realm in human evolution. You know, this is something that, I mean, we haven't talked about angels in our society since the New Age movement. You know, when
Right.
angels are very popular, you know, with the angel cards and trinkets and, you know, ceramic figures and all that stuff. You know, unfortunately, most of that's gone away. But if we look back through the literature of human history, we see that there have been these beings that have been there all along, and they've played some sort of really seminal role in human history, which we don't understand, have not understood, but now it's time. It's time for us to work in conscious partnership with the angels of evolution. They've had our backs for a long time. They've been nudging us gently, and it's difficult for them because they, as I mentioned, you know, because they're not physical beings, they don't have agency in the physical world. They need partners to work with, and we're the best candidates right now.
Maybe the raccoons if we go extinct or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or the dolphins or whatever.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Micah, you bring such heart and passion and an expansive understanding of our times and of evolution. Anything at all that you want to say in sort of bringing this conversation to closure? And feel free to take as long and go in any direction that you want. But I just want to invite you to share anything there is left to share so you can really feel complete about this conversation.
You know, Carolyn Baker, again, in a workshop she did recently, quoted a poet whose name escapes me, unfortunately, but the line that jumped out at me was, "What can be lost will be lost."
Oh, wow.
So if that's true, then we who are awakening need to focus on what must not be lost, on what must come to birth. And
Yes.
that's where my attention is these days. That and training these sort of evolutionary midwives or evolutionary catalysts, if you will. And you know, we hear that at least 98% of all species that ever lived on this planet have gone extinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we need to realize that all species become extinct. All civilizations come to an end. Right. All stars die. Maybe all galaxies die. Maybe all universes die. But evolution continues.
Yes.
Love and spirit remain, and mysteriously, we remain. And that's the bigger picture. That's the greater reality that we're just beginning to grasp. And so what that means is we're all essentially compost here. but we have the capacity for being conscious compost. You know? and that's a very subversive strategy, by the way.
Wow. My brain goes to sort of humorous bumper stickers, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So if what can be lost will be lost. So another poet said recently, what you are not will die, and what you are will not. In other words, what is real will persist, and what is not will not persist. You know, and that goes with what Daniel Schmachtenberger says, which I love. Unsustainable means self-terminating.
Yes.
So we means that we can let all of that go. and learn how to align with what's emerging in us and through us. And listen, you know, we might lose this planet. That's definitely possible. We could lose the human species. And that seems especially likely now, but I think that's mostly because we haven't really understood evolution. We haven't understood the angels of evolution. But even if we do lose it all, the work that we must do remains. The mission remains the same. If we can't bring the cosmic moral society to birth here on this planet, then we have to do it somewhere else. This is the dream of the universe itself, not just our dream. So what I would say is that the angels of evolution will not let us off the hook. You know, evolution is relentless, and it will prevail, and we will ultimately yield and become angels of evolution ourselves and join them in the great work of ending separation.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.